It has to be good. Okay. I don't want to. I'm not sure. That album. Yeah, I do. I know
Hey everybody! Hi! I won't use that because it's way too high. Thank you guys so much for being here today at Fearless Presents. This is our first Fearless Presents ever. For those of you who are like, what the hell is Fearless Presents? Fearless Presents is a new comedy series presented by Fearless Comedy Productions, where we're going to put a different comedy act on this stage the fourth Saturday of every month. So this is our first show. We're really honored to have the awesome and talented Reverend Matthew Kesson be our first performer for this series. He's performed in the Encyclopedia Show. He's performed at Convergence. He's performed at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. He's performed at the Science Museum. He has the voice of a god, and I'm sure you will. Next month, our show is the Killer Bees Improv Movie Show, so please make sure to come back for that. That's on October 28th, also at 10:30. I don't want to talk your ears off. I want to get you into the show. Are you guys ready to have a good time? All right. Well, without any further ado, please welcome the Reverend Matthew Kesson.
Hello, I'm Reverend Matt, and today I'd like to talk to you about the complete history of monsters. Every monster there has ever been. By which I, of course, mean most monsters. I'll have to leave a few out. By which I mean I will have to leave a lot out. Most of them. Almost all, and so what my clever and physically extremely attractive audience must have figured out by now. Seriously, call me. Is that what I'd really like to talk about is a history of monsters generally as a concept. And in order to do that, we first need a definition of terms. We'll start with all the words I've said so far. Hello is a greeting. Tell you what, I will take your obvious derision as a sign that I should stick to just one word, monster. For the purposes of Reverend Matt's Monster Science, the series you are currently viewing, which of course started as a series of short talks at the Minneapolis Encyclopedia Show, and which has since grown into a major world religion, controlling at least a third of the world's governments. The definition of monster is rather broad. It is essentially any living or seemingly living creature that by virtue of its appearance or abilities is a creature that currently does not exist. This, of course, includes and is centered on the usual misshapen or hybridized creatures that dwell at the fringes of humanity's domain and are a threat to it. But it also includes such disparate entities as, say, various old gods, who are often the opposite numbers of monsters in the old stories, but under our definition mean essentially the same thing. In another direction, Bud, because dogs can't play basketball, that is insane, you are insane. And this concludes my remarks on Air Bud in a hopefully everlasting fashion. It also includes the undead, though this language would technically exclude them. But of course, a definition of a monster that excludes vampires and zombies cannot be a functional one, as it would reduce the shared world narrative underpinnings of Count Chocula to ruins. The definition does not currently include robots, though I have of late been rethinking this and have previously grandfathered in Mechagodzilla. This vagueness around the edges is in a way appropriate. Monsters are very frequently interstitial creatures, creatures of liminal spaces, difficult to categorize and organize by their very nature. But really, at the end of the day, I wanted to talk about both dinosaurs and werewolves, and monster seemed like as good a word as any. There is actually a word in English, teratology, that means the study of monsters, but unfortunately it is not relevant to our use tonight, because what it refers to is the study of humans born with broad physical abnormalities. And let's not call that the study of monsters, you know? That's gross, and stop it. Plus, it takes away a potentially very serviceable word from a project like this one, which is, of course, worse than referring to innocent people as monsters because it is inconveniencing me. Finally, we will not here be using it in its metaphorical form to refer to people like Adolf Hitler or other political leaders that I bet you can think of on your own. Because monsters are best as outsiders, separated from humanity by time or place or common community, and people such as this rest comfortably in the center of society. Or to put it another way, I like actual monsters. Now, there are 4 categories of monsters, which have been agreed upon by comparative sociologists for many decades, or I made them up a little bit ago and I'm speaking about them publicly for the first time. One of those. They are organized by belief, the level at which they are thought to be real or otherwise. So, let's look at those 4 categories one by one. The first category is the prehistoric, easily enough identified as any extinct animal, and the most real of the 4 categories, almost universally believed in. And if you don't believe in dinosaurs, then I only have one simple request for you, and that is that you never use any sort of language ever again. The history of prehistoric creatures is, of course, the history of life on Earth. And I find this is something that many perfectly well-educated people know very little about, as if the Cambrian explosion is somehow not relevant to their professional or family lives. And I can't believe that. I won't. And so I am here to fix this. Okay. Life on Earth, in the form of bacteria and other microbes, first appeared as early as 4.28 billion years ago, which is remarkable because the oceans first formed about 4.4 billion years ago, and the planet itself 4.54 billion years ago. So life appeared 260 million years after the formation of the planet and 120 million years after there was water to sustain it. And these are huge, giant periods of time, yes, but given that our base measure is 4.5 billion, it's really squat. 260 million is like less than half of that. Life appeared very quickly on the Earth, presumably as a result of some sort of chemical reaction that was possible in the conditions of the time. The Drake equation, an equation full of speculative variables meant as an exercise in determining the odds of being contacted by extraterrestrial life, contains separate variables for planets that are capable of developing life and planets that do in fact develop life. Contemporary thinkers regard these two as redundant, because if a planet has what is necessary to develop life, then it will. That is how chemistry works. If you have vodka and orange juice together, then you have a screwdriver. Maybe not a very good screwdriver, but a screwdriver nevertheless. Now, life is thought to be the result of a chemical reaction because literally everything else is. The nature of this reaction is, however, unknown. It has not been reproduced, nor does it appear to occur naturally anymore. No bartender has reported putting too much bitters into an old-fashioned and spontaneously generating life, for example. And that's my second reference to mixology in like 2 minutes. Maybe I need a refill? By the way, mixology is a word that I'm pretty sure was invented by a 7-year-old. And 7-year-olds shouldn't be thinking about mixology. Anyway, there used to be a legitimate scientific theory called spontaneous generation, first put forth by Aristotle, that held that animals were sometimes just generated by various conditions. Jean-Baptiste von Helmont, working in the 17th century, even had specific recipes. A piece of dirty cloth plus wheat would, in 21 days, generate mice. And basil, put between 2 bricks and left in sunlight, would create scorpions. Science. Sometimes it didn't try very hard. But at least it tried a little. The lack of an answer to the question of how life first came to be is often used as a gotcha by creationists. If science can't explain this, then science can't explain anything. And the only recourse left to us is that Wotan created the world from the bones of the giant emir. Of course, if actual science fled to the supernatural at the first sign of trouble like this, then we'd all be applying leeches to ourselves for toothaches and taking chariots to work, even though that does sound pretty rad. In any case, there are many mysteries left to science. Yes, that's why scientists still have jobs. That's why they're not all sitting poolside smoking cigars and fur coats with dancing girls all around them, which is what I understand scientists do when they're not doing science. Moving on, I could use my entire hour and a half here complaining about creationists, but I won't. Instead, let's talk about what happened next in the history of life on Earth, which is nothing. For 1.83 billion years. And here's where we can talk about time scale for a bit. 1.83 billion years, life just hung out as microbes, and that's a number that none of us understands. You know how a year ago nobody thought Trump could be elected? 1.83 billion years is 1.83 billion times that long. Only carbon dating and math can save us now. We think the Revolutionary War was in some unguessable gulf of history. We cannot, in fact, get our heads around so much as 1,000,000 years, or around the fact that Tyrannosaurus lived much closer in the timeline to us than it did to Stegosaurus. But nevertheless, these are all some facts. So, what happened 2.4 billion years ago, as those of you doing the math in your heads have already figured out, and to those of you doing the math in your heads, calm down. It's a comedy show. Comedy show loaded with facts, but a comedy show nevertheless. Was what's called the Great Oxygenation Event, and also the Oxygen Catastrophe, and the Oxygen Holocaust. And again, I need everybody to calm down. The thing that merited these lurid titles was indeed a very big deal in the history of life, and also remarkably dull from a time traveler's perspective, which is, of course, the perspective we need to be focusing on. What happened was simply that some of the microbes had evolved photosynthesis about 1 billion years previously, deriving energy from the sun rather than from minerals in their environment. Now, the waste product of this process was and is oxygen, which before this had been rare in the global environment and indeed lethal to most Earth life. And by the time of the Holocaust, oxygen levels had increased to the point where they now killed off most life on Earth. The survivors being the photosynthesizers and those microbes that evolved to not only survive the presence of oxygen, but to thrive on it. Such life forms are known as aerobic organisms. But at this time, still microorganisms. And so this Holocaust was still totally dull to time travelers unless everything emitted tiny screams and the time travelers could maybe stand to see a therapist. One particularly interesting sight back in those times might be to do with the fact that another thing that requires oxygen in the atmosphere is fire. And hence the whole capacity for that on Earth was caused by microbes evolving photosynthesis. But again, everything's microscopic at this point, and there's not a lot to burn. I guess you could bring your own stuff to burn to 2 billion years ago, or you could just burn it in your backyard. And so things stayed microscopic in Dullsville for another impossible gulf of time. Multicellular organisms evolved about 1.7 billion years ago, but were still microscopic. 555 million years ago, the bilateria evolved. And what the bilateria were animals with a front and a back. If you're going to hate evolution for any reason, hate it for being so boring for almost 4 billion years. Then, 525 million years ago, this all changed with something called the Cambrian explosion. Pictured here, and here, and here. All from different angles. Each sweeter than the last. I mean, look, these people are walking away from an explosion. They don't even care. Dang! What the Cambrian explosion actually was a sudden crazed flourishing of evolution, where before we had been through almost 4 billion years of microbes, suddenly it was not microbes, all kinds of not microbes. And nobody really knows why, what triggered it. It had to be something. Evolution is often thought of as a progression, as competition and one-upmanship. But if that were so, then after 4 billion years, we'd have pangolins that had laser eyes and could fly at light speed. And we don't. That's not real because science doesn't always give us what we want. And neither does evolution. It just gives us what is necessary to survive in ecological niches as they arise with a minimum of energy expenditure. Note that I all but accidentally just referred to all of the results of evolution, which is to say all life on Earth, as us. And though evolution is cold, objective science, I feel that it also has a sort of ethical implication, which is that everything on Earth that is alive is related. Everything is of a blood. And this is what creationists hate the most about it. Their whole thing is that we are not like animals because animals are somehow reprehensible. And that is one of the most appalling things I've ever heard. And I promised you I wouldn't do this. I promised my mother I wouldn't do this. Moving on. So nobody really knows what conditions changed to cause the Cambrian explosion, in some part because it was 525 damn million years ago. It's a miracle we even know it happened at all. I mean, do you have any ideas? If so, write your nearest scientist. They may write you back saying, I'm a theoretical physicist and this has nothing to do with me. But do not let that deter you. They have to say that. And what followed the explosion was a period of wild evolutionary experimentation. You had, for example, Opabinia, which had 5 eyes and a single tentacle with a claw on the end of it. It was the 1950s space alien of prehistory. There was Aquilonifer, which would carry its young around with it all in the end of long, thin tethers, which I find completely terrifying for some reason. Trilobites were a common and well-known body plan, though it is less well-known that some of them look like this, and whatever environmental pressure, and whatever environmental pressures caused this to be the most reasonable evolutionary solution are unknown, but must have been very exciting. One thing to note about all of these is that they have bilateral symmetry, mirroring right and left sides, and a head with its mouth and eyes out in the front of it. And this is by no means the only way animals evolved. Starfish, for but one example, are a very successful sort of animal with none of these familiar traits. But they're the traits that we have, and hence the traits we pay the most attention to, and that's fine. We will pursue that line, pausing only to remark that bilateral symmetry is thought to have evolved because it is a very good body plan for swimming, and that advantage, no longer relevant, is nevertheless a very important part of why we look and are the way we are. But there are many other options, which is why it drives me crazy when space aliens look like Caucasians. Also in evolution, there's bigness, people like that. Camosaurus was 20 feet long and basically a giant squid with a shell and could be said to have ushered in the really heavy metal part of the history of life. As things moved on to land, we got Arthropleura, an 8-foot centipede. And I am not, in fact, bothered by modern centipedes myself, but I am bothered by this because I'm a rational person. Meganura was a dragonfly-like insect with a 28-inch wingspan, and since dragonflies hunt other flying animals, if they were alive now, you'd be able to watch them pluck sparrows right out of the sky. But alas, there were no birds in those days, and we do not live in the best of all possible worlds. Another product of the Cambrian explosion was fish, and these are, of course, our ancestors, so let's talk about them, though not for very long, because fish are super boring. To me, more power to you if you're into them, and it does make me a bad Minnesotan, but then I'm also told that if you're a man around here and your OkCupid profile lacks photos of you holding fish, that this is an enormous turn-on. Pro tip. But there were some early fish that even I would love to take a photo with, which is really just the law of averages. Remember that we're dealing with the entire Earth in periods of tens or hundreds of millions of years. Some of the fish are going to be interesting. For example, Bothriopolis and Pterapsis, which were trying to evolve into spaceships. Piloted by Opabinias, presumably. The sharks did good work with Heliocoprion, which had a circular saw for a lower jaw. And Stethacanthes, which had a scrub brush coming out of its mouth. Today, of course, we have hammerhead sharks and sawfish. Power drill sharks and 3D printer sharks presumably await discovery. Dunkleosteus was 20 feet long and looked like this, and its mouth wasn't even teeth but sharpened armor plates, and it stood on mountaintops playing guitar solos. Then, 375 million years ago, some fish started hauling themselves onto land and evolved into the first tetrapods, which is to say 4-limbed vertebrates. And so the age of salamanders was born. Now, that may sound also boring to you, and it was. But they did make a solid attempt or two. Amphibians evolved into sea snake forms like Ophinopteron, giant alligator forms like Prionosuchus, and weirdly enough, Dimetrodon forms like Platyhystrix. Diplocaulus had a boomerang for a head, though it wouldn't come back when thrown. Please don't ask me how I'm so certain about that. Mastodontosaurus had the most disappointing false advertising name of any animal in all of history, but it did have holes in its snout to let two long teeth at the end of the lower jaw through, and I guess that's something. Amphibians, they tried real hard. But they could never be as good as the amniotes, which arose about 312 million years ago. These are animals whose fetuses are incubated in shelled eggs laid on land or later in wombs, and there were two branches of them. One, the sauropsids, would evolve into reptiles, birds, and in between those two, the best animals ever to be alive. The other, the synapsids, would later evolve into mammals, though they started off as animals that would appear to be reptiles to our eyes, scaly and low-slung. Dimetrodon was one of these, and it belonged to a completely different group from the ancestors of modern reptiles. A lot of great stuff happened here, including Coelurosaurus, a small gliding reptile with extremely mobile wings and a little ceratopsian frill on its head, and why everything didn't evolve from this, science cannot tell us. But just a moment ago I implied dinosaurs, so I need to skip ahead a bit. 252 million years ago, the Great Permian Extinction Event went down, the most severe extinction event in all of history, worse than the oxygen holocaust, worse than the extinction of the dinosaurs to come later. 83% of all life on Earth died off, and it was the only extinction event ever to hit the insects. It appears to have been caused by a major meteor strike, which then set off some supervolcanoes, which then put huge amounts of poison into the atmosphere. Then probably a Martian invasion, an Omega bomb, and Megatron, I don't know. And so the Dimetrodons and the sweet saber-toothed dog lizards called Gorgonopsids and all kinds of stuff like that were wiped out. What wasn't wiped out was the Lystrosaurus, who disappeared. Oh, Lystrosaurus. Well, there were Lystrosaurus. They're these sort of awful-looking pig lizards. And the absence of any other mammals, or animals of any kind, they took over. 95% of individual terrestrial vertebrates for a time were Lystrosaurus. It was like a pig lizard zombie apocalypse. Weird. But it was not to last, because now it was the beginning of the Mesozoic pictured here. And as soon as evolution snapped back and decided everything didn't have to be Lystrosaurus, things got bitchin' fast. The first period, the Triassic, was an age of a variety of different sorts of animals vying for domination. In this corner you had the Rauisuchians, these sorts of dinosaur-headed running land crocodiles. In this corner, the Rhynchosaurs, unrelated beaked herbivores. In this other additional corner were the Phytosaurs, an abundant clade of crocodile-like animals that were not particularly closely related to crocodiles, but were rather crocodile posers. In yet another corner of the ring, the dinosaurs, which evolved in the Triassic in running, agile predator forms and heavy, powerful herbivore forms. And in corner number 5, the pterosaurs, the first vertebrates on Earth to evolve powered flight. And in one last corner, the mammals, which also evolved in the Triassic, and which also were strong contenders for domination. Ha ha, just kidding. They started off as small, nocturnal rat-like animals and stayed that way for over 150 million years. You suck, mammals. At the end of the Triassic, 201 million years ago, there was another mass extinction, though a less severe one than the ones we've touched on here. Just enough of a one to clear the playing field for the dinosaurs. And the pterosaurs, flying animals, tend to do well in the mass extinctions. So began the real age of dinosaurs, the best age in the history of life. And don't take my admittedly maniacally biased word for it. Look at the numbers. This was the first time that a single group of reasonably closely related animals had occupied all of the major large terrestrial animal ecological niches, and they did it for 135 million years, over twice as long as the mammals have done so. And it only ended because of 6 tons of rock from outer space. 2 groups in particular, the theropods, which is to say the carnivores mostly, and the sauropods, immediately at the beginning of the age developed forms so successful that for these 135 million years, they changed only in terms of size, dimension, and a detail here and there, retaining the same body plan otherwise. And then over here there were triceratopses. Triceratopses, you guys! I cannot emphasize this enough. If you don't understand why this was the best, then see me after the show. But alas, all good things must come to an end, and the aforementioned 6 miles of space rock crashed into the Gulf of Mexico 65 million years ago, and that was it for the dinosaurs, except for the flying theropods, known these days as birds. And so began the Cenozoic, the age of mammals, and things got pretty dull again for a while. Mostly things evolved into sheep and pigs, and though as it was with the salamanders, there were a few efforts here and there to evolve into something interesting, such as Apicamelus, a camel trying to be a giraffe, Brontops, which was brought to you by the letter Y, Basilosaurus, a misnamed early whale that will be coming up again in the next section, and Uintatherium, which went ahead with this for some reason. A little over 60 million years. Listen, 60 million years of this sort of thing, and then 2.5 million years ago it was the Pleistocene and its attendant ice ages. Here at last the mammals in general started to really go nuts, with woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos and giant sloths and saber-toothed cats and giant raccoons, which I'm not even making up. The primates got into it as well, with a 10-foot-tall ape evolving in Asia, and some small running apes in Africa developing more sophisticated tool use, and then later imagination, language, moral superiority, child labor, and meatloaf. Everywhere they went, the megafauna, which by the way I will add are often referred to in the literature as charismatic megafauna, which is the name of my signature scent, went extinct, and this primate is officially an extinction event all its own. In the last 100 years, the rate of life forms on Earth going extinct has been over 1,000 times the planet's baseline. And the primate responsible for this is, of course, orangutans. God damn them. And such is the history of prehistoric life on Earth and our first category. So let us move on to the next category and the next point in our gradient of belief.